So throughout the years, I've criticized EA a lot as a company on this channel, namely when it comes to their corporate practices and executives' ethics. But when EA greenlights the right project and let the devs have at it under the right development conditions, magical things can happen. For example, Jedi Fallen Order, that's a game that I really loved, and I cannot wait for Jedi Survivor. It Takes Two was Game of the Year 2021, and it ended up being my personal Game of the Year for 2021. Mass Effect Legendary Edition was a really well put together package. And now with the Dead Space remake, EA had a tall order to meet, given how beloved the original game is. And having played roughly 6 hours of the pre-release review copy provided by EA, I am delighted to say that from what I've played, roughly halfway through the game, they pulled it off. The original Dead Space came out all the way back in October of 2008, so we're talking about a 15-year-old title that's being given new life through this remake, and what a great remake this is. It's true to the original while adding appropriate enhancements, changes, and modernizations. This isn't quite Resident Evil remakes or Final Fantasy VII remake where it feels like a completely different game. This is very much a modern recreation of the original a la Demon's Souls remake rather than a full-fledged reimagining. It goes without saying that the most immediately noticeable upgrade is the visuals, which do look breathtaking compared to the original. There's no denying that the remake is leagues ahead in both visual and audio fidelity. Essentially, Dead Space Remake's graphics is how I imagined the original looked like in my head, back when the original's graphics were impressive for the time. I don't have to tell you that character, creature, and object models as well as textures look far more detailed and realistic, and there's some great touches like how Isaac can get soaked in blood after a bloody encounter. But the thing that really does it for me is the game's lighting. There's just a starker contrast of lighting effects that enhances the gritty and suspenseful mood. All these visual enhancements just make the remake so much more atmospheric, the Ishimura all the more eerie, and the darkness all the more unnerving. I'd say Callisto Protocol is a bit more impressive from a pure fidelity standpoint, but the Ishimura I find to be the more memorable setting, made all the more memorable by the remake's visual enhancements to models, environments, enemy and boss encounters, and set pieces. The game performs beautifully too. On my PC with a 3080 Ti at 1440p ultra settings, I was getting an average of 100 to 120 frames per second, 90 being the lowest it ever dipped to, and that's while recording with OBS. The game sounds fantastic too, from the guns to the myriad sound effects to the creature noises to the creepy atmospheric soundscapes. Adding to the immersiveness is the seamless one-shot camera with no load times during gameplay, a welcome addition. The game keeps you in the action at all times, which matches beautifully with the game's seamless menus and HUD-less approach that cleverly gives players relevant information through in-game implementations and assets. Even continuing your game from the main menu will seamlessly transition you to the last checkpoint, which is kinda neat. With all that said, though, you've got to give credit to how well the original game has held up. There was already a great foundation there that the EA Motive team didn't have to mess too much with, but I also have to give kudos to the EA Motive team for doing a great job with building upon that foundation and sprucing up what needs to be spruced up, making the Ishimura feel that much more like a real, lived-in, and ravaged place. The level design has also aged particularly well, though there are some adjustments to it, but all of it feels tastefully selected and implemented. You can still feel the inspiration that Dead Space's level design and even aspects of its aesthetic took from Metroid Prime. Much like its inspiration, the Ishimura has a great sense of interconnectedness that at times make it feel like a horizontal Dark Souls, and the backtracking is done in a really smart way with a combination of the tram system and cleverly laid out shortcuts that you can open up down the line. You'll also be encouraged to backtrack as you progress through the campaign by how the game grants you access to higher clearance levels that will essentially allow you to open up previously inaccessible doors, which might take you to rooms where you'll find valuable loot and resources. Now, the game can sometimes feel like a labyrinthian combination of hallways and rooms, but fortunately, the original game's locator makes a return, so you can easily track currently selected main or side objectives, and that will ensure that you never get lost searching for your next location. It's a nice feature to have, especially when the remake seems to have added some extra rooms here and there for players to explore and loot. There's definitely stuff in the remake's level design that's been moved or added. It's definitely not the exact same layout you remember, but never anything too transformative or to the game's detriment. Everything still feels familiar enough, but every once in a while you'll be like, oh, wait a minute, that wasn't there before. The game also features the occasional simple but neat puzzles and environmental interactions, some taken directly from the original, others that may have been adjusted here and there or added to this game to mix gameplay up in between combat encounters. Nothing too intellectually challenging per se, but they still serve as a nice break to give the game a sprinkle of added variety. With all said and done though, the fundamentals and key level design beats from the original are still fully intact and very much will jog the memories of those who played the original game, and in some key ways they've definitely enhanced aspects of it. Same goes for enemy encounters. There are a lot of marquee ones you know and love that are still there, but some enemies might appear in places that they didn't in the original, and encounter design may be slightly adjusted, but the deviations, again, are never egregious. Speaking of encounters, moment-to-moment combat in this game remains as satisfying as ever, if not more satisfying than before. Those who play the original will still feel right at home here, but everything just looks, sounds, and feels better and more refined. Movement alone feels more precise and less cumbersome than in the original Dead Space. Iconic elements like the dismemberment system remains fully intact, but it's now even more gruesome. Extra details like flesh tearing off from enemy limbs as they're weakened, the added visual fidelity to monsters and their animation, and weapons looking and sounding better and more impactful all contribute to encounters having that much more weight and presence. Beyond looking and sounding good, what makes Dead Space encounters particularly fun is the sheer variety of weapons you'll eventually have at your disposal, having access to everything from the classic plasma cutter pistol, the pulse rifle assault weapon, the self-explanatory flamethrower, to more unique ones like the Ripper and the contact beam, each with unique gimmicks or alternate firing modes, and combined with the ability to equip 4 at a time, alongside powers like stasis and kinesis. All that means that you can really experiment and improvise during combat and pull off some pretty cool sequences. Or you can strategize in interesting ways, like for example, when I want to conserve ammo, I use the plasma cutter or pulse rifle to take out enemies' legs and slow them down, and then I follow up with the Ripper up close and personal to finish creatures off by essentially grinding them down into mincemeat with a single round. I do wish Dead Space had a bit more enemy variety, but the variety of tools at your disposal did help keep combat fresh and fun throughout, further bolstered by the game having this nice and steady sense of progression. Beyond unlocking new weapons as you go further into the campaign, you can upgrade your weapons and suit capabilities by finding weapon upgrade parts and spending nodes found throughout the nooks and crannies and crevices within the Ishimura. And the chance of finding these nodes that essentially serve as lootable skill points does encourage you to go off the beaten path a bit and explore. Beyond that, you can buy some weapon and armor upgrades from the store with credits, and you will progressively just feel yourself becoming perceivably more powerful and versatile as you make headway through the campaign and engage with these systems. Armor upgrades in particular come with the added satisfaction of not only increasing your limited inventory size for resource management, but also a visual upgrade for what is an iconic and badass suit design. Now, much of this is nothing new to the remake per se, but within the context of all the new enhancements, it all just feels fresh to re-experience. Though there are some changes that are definitely drastic and unique to the remake, but they're all positive changes in my experience. Zero Gravity, for example, uses Dead Space 2's free-form floating mechanics rather than Dead Space 1's magnetic boots mechanics. Not only does this make Zero Gravity segments control better and just cooler to navigate, it also allows you to engage in some badass Zero Gravity combat. Another drastic change is the addition of a voice for Isaac, with Dead Space 2 and 3's Gunner Wright returning to voice the character, which fans I'm sure will be delighted by. Giving Isaac a voice also allowed the developers to add a bit more color to the script and dialogue, making character interactions and narrative developments feel less impersonal. And it seemed as though voiceover in general has been completely re-recorded and redone for the remake, and from what I've played, I personally dig the performances and direction here. While I wouldn't say there's anything that will pull at your heartstrings in a major way, the voiceover work here is solid for exactly what this game needs. Now, as far as story and characters and the overall narrative goes, For me, these were never the biggest highlight of the original Dead Space, so it's no different in the remake, whose story is pretty faithful to the original. There's nothing offensive about the story or anything, but nothing to write home about either. It's just kind of there, the plot is serviceable enough to push you forward through the roughly 10 to 15 hour long campaign, and the text and audio logs scattered throughout alongside the environmental storytelling make for interesting pieces to put together to determine what happened to the Ishimura. But some minor adjustments and extrapolations aside, the story is pretty much the same as it should be, so I imagine that whatever impression you had of the original Dead Space's narrative won't be too different from the remake. As for the less than stellar aspects of the game, honestly I can't think of too many. I would say that melee and stomping still feels like a useless and unwieldy combat maneuver. It's mostly there to break open boxes or corpses for additional loot, though stomping, I will admit, will never not be amusing and an iconic aspect of Dead Space. I just wish the game did a little more with melee and stomping. Something else worth noting is that I'd recommend people crank up the difficulty from normal. In normal mode, I never found myself feeling resource deprived or cornered enough to make enemy encounters all that tense. They were still fun and exciting, but I never felt that sense of, oh my god, they're gonna get me. Another nitpick would be that navigating menus on PC can feel a bit cumbersome, as menus feel like they were built for controller and were retrofitted for keyboard and mouse. Nothing untenable or that you can't grow accustomed to, but menu and HUD interactions just felt a bit awkward to me. And then one last thing to note for PC players is that I encountered this major issue where having certain devices like a USB foot pedal button plugged in made keyboard and mouse inputs go completely haywire, as in none of the buttons worked as they had been mapped. You can see right here that the sprint button would not work for some reason, and here you can see I could not lower my weapon, and pausing the game would result in the character automatically shooting for some reason. So if stuff like this happens to you, try unplugging some stuff and see if that fixes input issues. Though I did report this issue, so developers are aware that this happened to me, so it might be that they'll resolve it by the time you play the game. These are about the only problems that I can think of. Other than that, I honestly cannot think of any major bugs or, game-breaking issues or anything that really stood out as a major design flaw. The game overall feels very polished and well-designed across the board. So based on what I've played thus far, would I recommend Dead Space Remake? Honestly, if you're an enjoyer of sci-fi, survival, horror, third-person shooters, or a fan of the Dead Space series, this is an easy yes for me. Striking a great balance of familiar and new, it's what people loved about the original, but better on pretty much all fronts. And even on its own merits, it's a really well-made video game that elevates the groundwork laid out by the original, and it's a game that I believe even newcomers who don't have the nostalgia goggles on will have a great time with. The game is on the shorter side of campaign-driven games at 10 to 15 hours, but it's quality time that I think many will deem worthwhile at full price, though if you can't justify the game's length, I'd understand some wanting to wait for a sale. But I'd definitely recommend picking this game up at some point if you're into this genre, because I think Dead Space Remake is a resounding success for what it set out to do, and a great way to kick off gaming in 2023. Here's to EA greenlighting more projects like this.